The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of shame. It coated Alara's tongue, a gritty film that was part earth, part humiliation. It settled on the frayed hem of her black mourning dress, a garment already so thin it was more memory than fabric. The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast bleached sky, beating down on the splintered steps of the courthouse where she stood. A crowd had gathered, a hydra of curious, pitying, and scornful faces. They were flies drawn to a carcass, and she was the meat. Beside her, Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of tallow, cleared his throat and unrolled a scroll of paper. His voice, a tempting authority, cracked under the weight of the afternoon heat. By order of the territorial court, he began the words a death sentence to settle the outstanding debts of the late Jedediah Thorne. All remaining assets and properties are to be liquidated in public auction. He paused, his eyes flicking nervously toward Alara. The crowd shifted, a collective murmur rippling through them like a foul wind. They knew what Jedediah's assets and properties amounted to. A broken-down mule, a set of rusted tools. And her, the mule went first, for $3 to a farmer who looked as weary as the animal. The tools fetched another $1.50, and then there was only silence. The sun beat down. A baby cried somewhere in the crowd, a thin, sharp wail that lanced through Alara's own womb, where her own child, a secret held for 3 months, lay curled in terrified innocence. She pressed a hand to her belly, a gesture she hoped looked like a nervous tick and not the desperate, protective shield it was. Jedediah had left her with nothing but a mountain of debt and this tiny, fluttering life. He had been a man of grand dreams and shallow pockets, his promises turning to dust as quickly as the whiskey on his breath. He'd ridden out one morning to chase a rumor of gold and had been found 2 weeks later, his horse lame and his body bloated, at the bottom of a ravine. The town had called it a tragedy. For Alara, it was merely the final betrayal. And now, Sheriff Miller said, his voice dropping, unable to meet her gaze, we have the matter of the indenture. He was referring to the contract Jedediah had signed with Mr. Abernathy, the town banker, a man whose heart was as hard and cold as the coins he hoarded. The contract stipulated that in the event of default, all of Jedediah's possessions, including his wife's labor for a period of 5 years, would be forfeit. It was a cruel, archaic clause, but legal in this godforsaken corner of the frontier. She was chattel, a commodity to be sold. What am I bid for the 5-year indenture of Alara Thorne? The sheriff asked the silent, staring faces. A strong woman, good for cooking, cleaning, farm work. His voice trailed off, the words obscene in the stark daylight. Abernathy himself stood at the front of the crowd, his arms crossed over his portly stomach, a smug, proprietary look on his face. He had no intention of bidding. He had orchestrated this humiliation as a warning to other debtors. He wanted to see her broken. He wanted the town to see her broken. A rough-looking man with a greasy beard and tobacco-stained teeth stepped forward. "I'll give you $10, he rasped, his eyes crawling over Alara's form in a way that made her skin feel like it was on fire. Laughter, cruel and sharp, erupted from a few men beside him. $10. The sheriff repeated, a flicker of relief in his eyes that someone had at least started the bidding. Do I hear 15? Alara's world narrowed to the space between heartbeats. The dust, the heat, the leering faces, the sheriff's hollow voice, it all blurred into a suffocating haze. She felt a wave of dizziness, the world tilting on its axis. The child within her gave a small, frantic flutter, as if it knew, as if it was pleading. Please, God, anyone, please. Her prayer was a silent scream in the hollow cavern of her soul. She was going to be sick. The blackness crept in at the edges of her vision. She saw the greasy man's triumphant grin as he reached into his pocket. This was it. This was the end of her world, and the beginning of a nightmare from which she would never wake. And then, from the deep shadows of the alleyway between the general store and the saloon, a voice cut through the air. It was not loud, but it carried a weight that made the heat shimmer and the crowd fall utterly silent. $100. Every head turned. The voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. It was a sound that belonged to the mountains, to the winter wind, not to the chattering hub of Redemption Gulch. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the punishing sunlight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark, dusty clothes that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and old scars, one that ran from his temple down his cheek, pulling at the corner of his mouth in a permanent, grim line. His eyes, shadowed by the brim of a battered hat, were fixed not on the sheriff, but on her. It was Silas Blackwood, the recluse, the man who owned the broken-down ranch at the edge of the territory, the one everyone whispered was haunted by the ghosts of his dead wife and child. He never came to town. He spoke to no one, yet here he was. Abernathy's smug expression curdled into disbelief. The greasy bidder's jaw hung open. The sheriff stared, his mouth agape. "Mr. Blackwood?" He stammered. $100? Silas didn't move, his gaze still locked on Alara. It was an unnerving look, not hungry like the other man's, but assessing, as if he were measuring her for a coffin or a crown. He gave a single curt nod. "But, sir," the sheriff floundered, "the indenture is for 5 years of labor." "The price?" "I'm not buying her labor," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He took another step forward, the dust swirling around his worn boots. He finally looked at the sheriff, and for the first time, Alara saw the full force of his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they held a pain so deep it seemed ancient. "I'm buying the debt, the whole of it. And I'm buying her hand in marriage." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Marriage. The word hung in the air, impossible and explosive. It was one thing to buy a woman's labor, another thing entirely to bind your life to hers. Abernathy's face turned a blotchy, furious red. "This is irregular. The contract is for indenture." Silas's gaze shifted to the banker, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The contract is to settle a debt. My offer settles it full. And it gives the woman a husband's protection, which is more than this town was prepared to offer." The accusation in his words was a physical blow. He reached into his coat, pulling out a worn leather pouch. He tossed it onto the courthouse steps. It landed with a heavy, final thud, the sound of coins settling, the sound of freedom. "There's more than 100 there. For the debt, and for the preacher's fee." He looked back at Alara, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. "And shadow. Well, Mrs. Thorne?" "You can have that man," he said, nodding towards the greasy bidder, who now looked terrified, "or you can have me." It wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. Her throat was tight, her voice a stranger to her own ears. The world was still tilted, but now through the haze, she saw a path. A dark, uncertain, terrifying path, but a path. Away from the auction block. She looked at the leering face of the man who had bid $10, and then at the scarred, grim face of the man who had offered her a name. One was a cage, the other was an unknown wilderness. She met Silas Blackwood's storm-gray eyes, and for a fleeting second, she saw not a monster, but a man who recognized the geography of her own private hell. He was broken too. She could see it in the lines around his eyes, in the way he held himself, as if bracing for a blow. They were two shipwrecks, washed ashore in the same storm. "I'll have you," she whispered, the words barely audible, but in the profound silence of the town square, they echoed like a gunshot. The journey to Silas's ranch was made in a silence as vast and empty as the landscape they passed through. He had collected her meager belongings, a single carpet bag with her mother's Bible, a spare dress, and a small carved wooden bird Jedediah had given her in a moment of rare sobriety. He loaded it onto the back of his wagon without a word, helped her up to the seat, and then they were moving, leaving Redemption Gulch and its staring, whispering faces behind them. The dust of the town was replaced by the dust of the open plains, a fine red powder that coated everything. Ilara kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't know what to say thank you. The words felt small, inadequate. They had been married by the town preacher in a hurried, mumbled ceremony on the courthouse steps, the ink on the certificate barely dry before Silas was leading her to his wagon. He had not touched her. He had not smiled. He had simply stood beside her, a solid, unmoving presence, his shadow falling over her like a shield. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was even more desolate than the rumors suggested. It was nestled in a shallow valley, crouched against a line of stark windswept mesas. The house was a simple log cabin, its roof sagging in the middle, like a tired old man's shoulders. The fences were a patchwork of new wood and rotted, broken rails. A few skeletal-looking cattle stood listlessly in a barren corral. The place didn't feel haunted by ghosts. It felt like a ghost itself, a hollow shell of what it might once have been. A small, untended graveyard sat on a nearby hill, marked by two simple wooden crosses, one larger than the other. His wife and child. The reality of his loss was a physical presence, a cold spot in the warm afternoon air. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He didn't offer her a hand. He simply waited. Ilara gathered her skirts and carefully made her way down, her legs stiff from the long ride. The silence was broken only by the wind, a low, mournful sigh that swept down from the mesas. "The well is over there," he said, his voice as rough as the bark on the cottonwood trees that lined the dry creek bed. "It's clean, the house. It needs work." He didn't apologize for it. He stated it as a fact, like the color of the sky or the hardness of the ground. He picked up her bag and carried it towards the cabin. She followed him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. What had she done? She had traded one prison for another, a public cage for a private one. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled of dust, wood smoke, and something else, a deep, settled grief. A simple stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center of the single room. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, covered with a pile of furs. It was a man's space, stark and functional, with no room for softness, no room for her. Silas placed her bag on the floor. "You can take the bed," he said, turning to face her. In the dim light of the cabin, his scars seemed deeper, his eyes darker. "I'll sleep by the fire." It was the first kindness he had shown her, and it almost broke her. The tears she had held back all day pricked at the back of her eyes. She swallowed them down, refusing to cry in front of this stranger, her husband. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice trembling. He gave a curt nod, as if her thanks were an inconvenience. "There's flour and beans in the pantry, some salted pork. I'll be outside, mending the fence before it gets dark." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence of his home. The first days were a blur of sharp, emotionally loaded silences and clumsy, unspoken negotiations. They moved around each other like two wounded animals, wary and uncertain. Ilara, desperate to prove her worth, to earn the $100 he had paid for her freedom, threw herself into turning the cabin into a home. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw, beat the dust out of the furs until her arms ached, and washed the single window until the light, thin and pale, could finally pierce the gloom. She found a small stash of his late wife's things packed away in a wooden chest, some faded calico fabric, a tarnished silver locket, a book of poetry. She touched them reverently, feeling like a trespasser, and quickly packed them away again. She would not erase the woman who had come before her, She would simply make a space for herself alongside the memory. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, his energy a silent, furious storm. He repaired the roof, reinforced the corral, and spent hours riding the perimeter of his land, his face a grim mask of concentration. He ate what she cooked without comment, his eyes fixed on his plate. The silence at the dinner table was a chasm. Between them, filled with the things they couldn't say. Her pregnancy was a secret she guarded with every fiber of her being. The morning sickness was a trial. She would slip out of the cabin at dawn, her hand pressed to her mouth, and retch behind the woodpile, praying he wouldn't hear. She was terrified that if he knew, he would see her as just another burden, a damaged good he had foolishly purchased. One evening, a week after her arrival, he came back later than usual, his shirt torn and a fresh cut bleeding on his forehead. He had been trying to break a wild Mustang he'd captured, and the horse had won. He slumped into a chair at the table, his body radiating exhaustion and pain. Alara, without thinking, went to the well, drew a bucket of cool water, and brought it to him with a clean rag. She hesitated for a moment, then gently began to clean the cut on his forehead. He flinched at her touch, his whole body going rigid. His stormy eyes shot up to meet hers, filled with a mixture of surprise and a deep, primal fear. It was the look of a man who had not known a gentle touch in a very long time. "Hold still," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He didn't pull away. He sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, as she cleaned the wound. Her fingers were gentle, her movements sure. In that moment, the space between them shrank. It was no longer a chasm, but a fragile bridge, built of a simple act of care. When she was done, she pulled back, her heart pounding. "Thank you," he rasped, the words sounding like they had been torn from his throat. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. That night, a storm rolled in, a violent, raging tempest that shook the small cabin to its foundations. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain came down in solid driving sheets. A loud crack of thunder woke Alara from a fitful sleep. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. A second later, a piece of the newly repaired roof gave way, and a stream of icy water began to pour onto the floor near the fireplace, dangerously close to where Silas was sleeping. She scrambled out of bed. "Silas!" she cried, her voice lost in the roar of the storm. He was already awake, grabbing a bucket. Together, in the flickering firelight, they worked to contain the deluge. They were a team, their movements synchronized by the urgency of the moment. The storm raged outside, but inside the small embattled cabin, a strange sense of solidarity was being forged. They were fighting a common enemy. They were protecting their home. When the worst of the storm had passed, they stood in the middle of the room, soaked to the skin, the floor covered in puddles. Alara was shivering, her thin nightdress clinging to her body. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop her teeth from chattering. Silas looked at her, and for the first time, his expression softened. The grim mask slipped, and she saw a flicker of concern in his eyes. He took one of the heavy furs from the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. His hands brushed against her arms, his touch warm and calloused. It was not a lover's touch, but it was a human touch, a touch of shared vulnerability. "You're cold," he said, his voice low. "We saved the floor," she replied, her voice muffled by the fur. He looked around the damp, disordered cabin, at the puddle of water still growing in the corner. A small, humorless smile touched his lips, a ghost of an expression that was gone as quickly as it came. "We saved a piece of it." The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was crisp and cool, and the sun shone with a gentle, forgiving light. Silas was already on the roof, hammering, when Alara emerged from the cabin. She had a pot of coffee in her hands. She climbed the ladder, her movements clumsy, and handed it to him. He took it without a word, but his eyes met hers over the rim of the cup, and in them she saw a new understanding. They had survived the storm together. They had survived the auction. They were survivors. The news of their marriage had spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. When Silas drove the wagon into town for supplies 2 weeks later, with Alara sitting beside him, the whispers followed them like a cloud of gnats. She could feel the eyes on her back, the judgment. In the stares. "That's her," a woman muttered from the boardwalk of the general store. "The one Blackwood bought." $100, another woman whispered to her friend, her voice a mixture of awe and contempt. "What does a man like that want with a wife anyway?" Abernathy, the banker, saw them from across the street. He stopped, his face tightening into a mask of pure venom. He saw not a new couple, but a challenge to his authority, a living, breathing testament to his public failure to break them. He said nothing, but his eyes promised retribution. Alara kept her head held high, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. She would not let them see her shame. She was Silas Blackwood's wife now. His name was her shield, his silent presence her fortress. But the whispers stung, each one a tiny paper cut on her already wounded soul. Not everyone was hostile. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, a kind, round woman with flour on her apron, came out of the bakery as they were loading their wagon. She bustled over, a warm, fragrant bundle wrapped in cloth in her hands. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice warm. "And Mrs. Blackwood." She emphasized the title, a small act of defiance against the town's gossip. "I baked an extra loaf of bread this morning. It's still warm. You should have it." She pressed the bundle into Alara's hands, her own warm and calloused. "It's a hard life out on the plains," she said, her eyes soft with a wisdom that went beyond words. "A body needs good bread." Alara was so overcome with gratitude she couldn't speak. She simply nodded, clutching the warm loaf as if it were a precious jewel. It was the first act of genuine kindness she had received from anyone in this town other than her husband. It was a small thing, a loaf of bread, but it felt like a feast. On their way out of town, they passed a small group of children playing by the creek. One of them, a little girl with bright red pigtails, looked up and saw Alara. She pointed. "Look, Mama," she said loudly. "It's the lady the scary man bought." Her mother quickly shushed her, her face turning a mortified shade of pink. Alara flinched as if she had been struck. The child's innocent words were more painful than all the malicious whispers of the adults. She felt Silas shift beside her on the wagon seat. His hand, calloused and rough, covered hers where it rested. On her lap, it was a firm, steady pressure, a silent message. "I am here. You are not alone." He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his touch was an anchor in the swirling sea of her shame. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. He did not pull away. And for the rest of the long, silent journey home, they rode as one. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The baby grew within her, her belly swelling into a gentle curve. She had still not told Silas, but she knew he knew. She saw it in the way he looked at her. Sometimes a fleeting, unreadable expression in his eyes. He started leaving a cup of ginger tea by her bedside in the mornings, a silent acknowledgement of her sickness. He widened the doorway of the cabin, his excuse being that it was easier to carry firewood through, but she knew it was for her, for the day when her belly would be too big to slip through the narrow opening. Their life fell into a rhythm, a quiet dance of shared labor and unspoken understanding. He taught her how to shoot, his large hands guiding hers on the stock of the rifle, his breath warm on her neck. She taught him how to read, his rough finger tracing the words in her mother's Bible by the firelight, his voice stumbling over the strange, unfamiliar shapes of the letters. They were building a life not out of love, but out of a shared need. For survival, for a place to put their broken pieces. One afternoon, a wagon appeared on the horizon. It was not a familiar wagon from town. It belonged to a Ute trader named Many Horses, a man Silas had known for years. He was an old man, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his eyes bright and intelligent. He and Silas greeted each other with a quiet respect that spoke of a long and trusted friendship. Many Horses' eyes fell on Alara, on her swelling belly, and a slow smile spread across his face. He looked at Silas, a knowing glint in his eye. "The earth is healing," he said, his voice soft. "It is good." He gave Alara a small leather pouch. "For the mother," he said, "to make the passage easy." Inside were dried herbs, their scent fragrant and earthy. That evening, the three of them shared a meal around the fire under the vast star-dusted sky. Many Horses told stories of the old days, of the spirits of the mountains and the wisdom of the earth. Silas, in the presence of his old friend, seemed to shed a layer of his armor. He spoke more than Alara had ever heard him speak, his voice low and resonant, telling stories of his own, of tracking mountain lions and surviving blizzards. Alara listened, her heart full. She was witnessing a part of her husband she had never seen before, a glimpse of the man he was before the grief had carved its scars into his soul. As Many Horses prepared to leave the next morning, he took Alara aside. "He is a good man," he said, nodding toward Silas, who was loading a gift of furs onto the Ute's wagon. His heart was broken into many pieces. "You are gathering them up one by one. Be patient with him. The deepest wounds are the slowest to heal." The first snows of winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in a thick, silent shroud of white. The world shrank to the small, warm circle of the cabin. The isolation, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a sanctuary. They were cut off from the world, from the whispers and the judgment of Redemption Gulch. It was just the two of them, and the child growing between them. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, Alara went into labor. It came on fast and hard, a wave of pain that stole her breath and brought her to her knees. Silas found her on the floor, her face pale with sweat, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. The mask of the stoic rancher fell away completely, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He looked as terrified as she felt. "It's too soon," he stammered, his voice tight with panic. "The blizzard, I can't get the doctor." "You don't need a doctor," Alara gasped, gripping his hand with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I need you." And in that moment, he became the man she needed him to be. He carried her to the bed, his movements gentle despite his panic. He built up the fire until the cabin was a warm, glowing haven against the storm. He boiled water. He held her hand, his calloused palm a lifeline in the sea of her pain. He whispered to her, his voice rough with emotion, telling her she was strong, that she could do this. He was no longer the silent, scarred stranger. He was her husband, her partner. The labor was long and brutal. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her body. But through it all, Silas was there. He wiped the sweat from her brow. He gave her water. He held her when the pain threatened to tear her apart. He was her rock, her anchor. In the darkest hour of the night, just before the dawn, with the blizzard still howling its fury, the sun was born. He was small, so small, but his cry was a fierce, defiant roar, a declaration of life in the face of the storm. Silas cut the cord with a shaking hand and wrapped the baby in a clean, warm cloth. He laid the child in Alara's arms. She looked down at the tiny, perfect face of her son, at his shock of dark hair, so like his father's, and her heart, which she thought had been broken beyond repair, swelled with a love so powerful it was a physical pain. Tears streamed down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of a gratitude so profound it had no words. She looked up at Silas. He was staring at the baby, his face a wreck of emotions. Tears were tracking paths through the dust and grime on his own cheeks. The scars on his face seemed to soften in the firelight. He reached out a tentative, trembling finger and touched the baby's cheek. "He looks like you," she whispered. Silas shook his head, his eyes never leaving the child. "He looks like her," he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "He has her eyes." He was talking about his first child. The ghost in the graveyard on the hill. Ilara's heart ached for him, for the loss he carried every day. "What was her name?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his storm gray eyes filled with a universe of pain. "Sarah," he whispered. Her name was Sarah, and his mother was Mary. It was the first time he had spoken their names to her. It was a gift, a sacred trust. He was letting her in, not just to his home, but to his heart, to the broken, shuttered room where he kept his deepest grief. "This is Jedediah," Ilara said, her voice soft but firm. "But we can call him Jed." Silas looked from the baby back to her, and in his eyes she saw not just the ghosts of the past, but the fragile, tentative hope for a future. He nodded, a single, slow movement. "Jed," he repeated, the name a prayer on his lips. The blizzard broke the next day. The world was silent, pristine, and new. The birth of their son had changed everything. The silence in the cabin was no longer a chasm, but a comfortable shared space, filled with the small sounds of the baby's breathing and the soft murmur of their own voices. A fragile, tender love was beginning to bloom in the winter wasteland of their hearts, a love born not of passion, but of shared survival, of mutual respect, of the fierce, protective bond they had forged in the heart of the storm. But the world outside their small sanctuary had not forgotten them. When the snows melted and the roads to town were clear again, trouble arrived in the form of a letter delivered by the sheriff. It was from Abernathy. He was challenging the legality of their marriage, claiming it was a sham, a conspiracy to Kuftha, defraud him of his rightful property, the 5 years of Ilara's indenture. And he was laying a claim on the child. He argued that since the child was conceived before her marriage to Silas, the baby was an asset tied to Jedediah Thorne's estate, and therefore subject to the original debt. He was demanding a hearing before the circuit judge who was due to arrive in Redemption Gulch in a month's time. The letter was a declaration of war. Abernathy was not just trying to take her freedom. He was trying to take her son. The thought was a cold, sharp knife in Ilara's heart. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with terror. "He can't," she whispered. "He can't do this." Silas's face was a thundercloud. He crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white. The old, hard mask was back, but this time it was not directed at her. It was directed at the world, at the man who was threatening to destroy the fragile peace they had built. "He won't," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I won't let him." The day of the hearing, the courthouse was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the spectacle. Abernathy sat at a table with his slick, city-bred lawyer, looking smug and confident. Ilara sat beside Silas, holding Jed tightly in her arms. The baby was wrapped in the blanket Mrs. Gable had given them, a small, warm weight against her chest. She could feel the town's eyes on them, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and a new, surprising current of support. The story of how Silas had saved her from the blizzard, how he had delivered his own son, had spread through the town, softening some of the harder hearts. Mrs. Gable was there, sitting in the front row, her expression one of fierce loyalty. The blacksmith was there, and a few of the other ranchers from the outlying areas. They were a small island of support in a sea of hostile faces. The judge was a stern, hawk-faced man with eyes that missed nothing. He listened patiently as Abernathy's lawyer laid out his case, twisting the law into a cruel weapon. He painted Ilara as a deceitful woman and Silas as a foolish, love-struck rancher who had been duped. He argued that their marriage was a farce, a business transaction, not a sacred union. When it was Silas's turn to speak, he stood up, his height seeming to fill the small courtroom. He was not an eloquent man, he did not know the law. But he spoke from the heart, his voice rough and steady. "I did not buy my wife, Your Honor," he said, his eyes fixed on the judge. "I paid a debt that this town was content to see a pregnant woman pay with her body and her dignity. I offered her my name and my protection because it was the right thing to do, because I know what it is to be alone. I know what it is to lose everything." His voice broke for a moment, and he glanced at Ilara, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion. "Our marriage was not born of romance. It was born of necessity. But it has become something more. We have built a life together. We have a son. We are a family. And no piece of paper, no amount of money, can change that." He sat down, the silence in the courtroom thick with emotion. The judge looked at Silas, then at Ilara, his gaze lingering on the sleeping baby in her arms. He turned to Abernathy. "Mr. Abernathy," he said, his voice cold, "this court is not in the business of tearing families apart. The law you are citing is intended to protect creditors, not to enable the trafficking of human beings. The debt has been paid. The marriage is legal. The child belongs with his mother and father." He banged his gavel on the desk, the sound a thunderclap of finality. Case dismissed. A wave of relief so powerful it was dizzying washed over Ilara. She sagged in her chair, burying her face in her son's soft blanket, her body shaking with silent, grateful sobs. Silas's hand came to rest on her shoulder, a firm, steady weight. It was over. They had won. As they left the courthouse, the crowd parted for them. Abernathy stood by the door, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He looked defeated, diminished. The power he had held over the town, the power of fear and debt, had been broken. As they passed, Mrs. Gable stepped forward and pressed Ilara's hand. "We're proud of you both," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Others murmured their agreement. The whispers that had once been filled with scorn were now filled with respect. They were no longer the bought bride and the broken rancher. They were the Blackwoods. They were survivors. They were family. They didn't go straight home. Silas drove the wagon not towards the plains, but up the small hill to the graveyard that overlooked his ranch. He stopped the wagon and helped her down, holding the baby as she steadied herself. They walked to the two simple wooden crosses. The wind was gentle here, the air sweet with the scent of pine and sage. Silas stood before the graves, his hat in his hands. "Mary," he said, his voice low and thick with a grief that would never fully fade. "This is Ilara, and this is Jedediah." He looked down at the baby in his arms, his face a mixture of sorrow and a fierce, protective love. "He's our son." He was not just introducing them, he was asking for a blessing. He was bridging the chasm between his past and his present, between his grief and his newfound hope. He was making his two families one. Ilara reached out and took his free hand, her fingers lacing through his. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. They stood there for a long time, the three of them, a silent communion of souls under the vast open sky. The ghosts of the past were not gone. They never would be. But they were no longer haunting the present. They were a part of the story, a part of the beautiful, broken, resilient tapestry of their lives. That evening, as the sun set, painting the mesas in hues of rose and gold, Silas and Ilara stood on the porch of their small cabin. The roof no longer sagged. The fences were strong and true. The house was filled with the scent of baking bread and the soft sounds of a sleeping baby. It was no longer a house of grief. It was a home. Silas turned to her, his storm-gray eyes soft in the fading light. He gently touched the scar on his cheek, the one that had always made him look so grim. "Mary gave me this one," he said. Softly, she threw a plate at me. We were fighting about the name for our daughter. A sad, gentle smile touched his lips. I wanted to name her Hope. It was the most he had ever shared about his past, a small, perfect jewel of a memory. He was letting her see all of him, the scars and the sorrows, the love and the loss. She reached up and traced the line of the scar with her finger. "It's a part of you," she said, her voice full of a love that was as deep and as real as the ground beneath their feet. "And I love all the parts of you." He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that was a promise, a prayer, a homecoming. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but of a quiet, enduring love, a love that had been forged in the crucible of shame and survival, of loss and redemption. They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, as the last of the light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. They had been sold, bought, and broken. They had been judged and found wanting by a world that understood nothing of the resilience of the human heart. But under the vast, silent, and watchful sky, they stood. Not whole, perhaps, for their scars would always be a part of them, but finally and forever home.